Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this studio talk. Today, we are going to discuss publishers' challenges, namely in the licensing and management of patient questionnaires that are included in medical literature. So my name is Tatiana Canar, and I have over 10 years of experience in pharmaceutical industry. And today, I'm manager at the author collaboration unit of MAPI Research Trust. My team is in charge of establishment of collaboration with the copyright holders of patient questionnaires, and we help them with the daily management of these questionnaires. I will let you introduce my colleague Frédéric.
Hello, my name is Frédéric. I'm an account executive at the author collaboration unit, and I have more than 17 years of experience in patients' questionnaires and in linguistic validation.
So let me introduce you MAPI Research Trust. We are a not-for-profit organization facilitating the exchange and access of the information in the field of patient questionnaires that are widely used today as clinical outcome assessments for the entire scientific community. We combine outcomes, data across languages, cultures, and technologies to support our customers to improve patients' quality of life. As part of global clinical research organization, we work in close interaction with the licensing, linguistic, scientific, and also electronic migration experts. For 30 years now, MAPI Research Trust has been considered as scientific community library and also as a meeting point for QA developers, academic users, commercial users, such as pharmaceutical companies, clinical research organizations, IT vendors. To date, we manage over 800 of questionnaires on behalf of copyright holders.
Thank you, Tatiana. We will now talk more specifically about the challenges around patient questionnaires, also known as clinical outcome assessments. But first, what are the patient's questionnaires, or as they are more known, clinical outcome assessment? The concept of measuring patient quality of life with patient-centered outcome research emerged in the 1990s, together with health-related quality of life. You will see on the right side a definition from the Health Authority, US Food and Drug Administration. A clinical outcome assessment is a measure that describes or reflects how a patient feels, functions, or survives. These questionnaires are largely used by pharmaceutical industry in clinical trials to provide evidence that their treatments actually improve the patient's quality of life. Using a clinical outcome assessment in a clinical trial is not anymore a nice to have, but a must be. The use of patients' questionnaire in clinical trials has significantly increased since the 2000s. In order for a questionnaire to be considered a clinical outcome assessment, it should be made of various components. So you have here an example of the dermatology, life quality index. You can see instructions on how the questionnaire should be answered. The item, so the question with the recall period and the concept. The response options, the number of the different response options, and finally, the score. So you may say, okay, but how does it relate to the publisher's words? And Tatiana will tell you more about that.
So today the users, they find the patient questionnaires included in a peer-reviewed journal, in an article, but then they have a lot of practical questions and scientific questions. So first of all, a questionnaire is administered in a clinical trial or in a research. So they will ask you for an official version in a paper, version in Word or PDF. They will ask for scoring instructions. Unfortunately, very often they are not included in the publication, so they need it to be able properly to score the questionnaire. They will ask whether there are already some existing translations and electronic versions of this score. If there is evidence or certification that these are qualitative translations and qualitative electronic migrations. And they will also ask if this questionnaire it is really a reliable and valid measure, and if there are any other related publications that could prove it. They will need a scientific support, very quick turnaround time, and we see it more often that they need guidelines and recommendations. So here, MAPI Research Trust team can assist the publishers. So let's speak about the use of the patient questionnaires in the international clinical research. So first of all, we have to keep in mind that the patient questionnaires, these are tools that are used to measure the subjective view of a patient about his disease or his treatment. So here we have to bring along altogether different worlds together. And first of all is the world of clinical research, and this is science. What means with the objective here to investigate treatment effect. So this implies rigor and methods to collect and to compare data, but also to generate results. And the questionnaires, they're particularly sensitive to different cultures and different languages. And we also have to think about the respect of the scientific integrity of the original questionnaire. So the standard translation process that is used to translate a novel, a book, a journal, can't be applied to the scientific measures. So we should never forget that we try to measure health status of a patient by conceptualizing it. The challenge is to obtain patients' answers that can be used to generate evidence for regulators. So that means that we need to create questions that are valid, that are reliable, and that are able to detect change in the health status of a patient. So all these together, we also have to think about electronic migration of the patient questionnaires. And here there are a lot of constraints for IT companies, namely if there is a small screen for a smartphone and they want to migrate it. So we need to respect the scientific integrity of the course. So every word makes sense. We have to protect data. So we speak about the individuals and about the patients and also about the scientific data. And the user experience. So clearly the migration of a questionnaire and then the completion of the questionnaire should be an easy and clear process to avoid any confusion. So all this represents evidence for the regulation for the linguistically validated translations and migrations. So now let's see what kind of requirements there are for the linguistic validation of the patient questionnaires. So first of all, there are scientific and research requirements. And here we need to ensure that the translations retain the concepts of the original questionnaire, and also to ensure that these concepts and these language versions, they are harmonized across the countries to allow international pooling and comparison of data. Then there are linguistic and cultural requirements, so they know that the translations and linguistic validation of the questionnaires, they are particularly sensitive to the cultures, and Frederick will give you several examples just after. And then we need to think about population requirements. So translations need to be relevant to the target population and should be accepted by the final users. This can be children, it can be caregivers, clinicians. So for instance, we might use the word headache and the word migraine for a clinician, or the word belly for a child, and the word stomach for clinicians or for the adults. So all this, represents evidence for the health authorities. So I'd like really to emphasize here that a patient questionnaire, it's not just a content in an article, and just to give a permission to use a questionnaire is very often not sufficient. So the use of questionnaire, the linguistic validation and the migration, they need to be controlled.
Let's now see some examples of linguistic validation. So linguistic validation is very specific and should not be mixed with translation. And there is a risk when a publisher gives permission to a user to translate the questionnaire that they will go to a translation company instead of going to an agency specialized in linguistic validation. As we mentioned, linguistic validation needs to follow a thorough process, and you will see why with this example. Are you able to cut your meat? You may say, well, we all understand this sentence, we understand the words. What's the issue with that? So we need to clearly identify what the developer of the questionnaire wants to measure, find the actual concept behind the words, and as we say, all that remembering that linguistic validation is not a simple translation. For this specific example, we took this item from the Health Assessment Questionnaire, which was developed in US English. We had to translate that into Hindi for India. What challenges did we face on that? Linguistic, cultural problems. In India, they don't use cutlery, and most of the population is vegetarian. So you cannot administer the item as it is. So we contacted the developer of the questionnaire, checking what is the concept behind this item. And he confirmed that the concept is to assess the patient's ability to do micro movements of the upper extremity. With this in mind, we contacted our translation team based in India and discussed, well, how it could be translated and culturally appropriate. And the solution was, are you able to break chapatis with your fingers? So seeing that from an external point of view, you could think, well, that's a mistranslation. But this is not, because the data gathered from this item is actually the correct one. Another quick example about the Swedish measure angina pectoris quality of life questionnaire, which this questionnaire is developed in Swedish for Sweden. The original questionnaire was, can you walk a short walk, about 2 kilometers? In the English for the UK version, it was translated as short walk, about a mile. When the version was tested on the US population, we received the feedback that it doesn't make sense because 1 mile is not a short walk. So we cannot say short walk about 1 mile. So here again, we went back to the developer, ensuring the construct we are measuring is a correct one. What is important here? Is it the notion of short walk, or is it the notion of length, 2 kilometers? The developer confirmed that the important construct is the short walks. So it was adapted in the final US English version as short walk, and between brackets, several blocks. So we can see from all these cases that a novel could be translated in different languages by different translators and without any issues, and this could coexist. However, Patient Questionnaire is a scientific measure, and it needs a very thorough linguistic validation and cultural adaptation process to respect its scientific integrity and also to allow comparability of data. Therefore, for clinical outcome assessments, we strongly recommend to have only one translation per language and per country to support, again, this comparability of data and progress in research. Let's move now to examples on the electronic implementation.
Thank you, Fred. So the electronic implementation of the patient questionnaires also needs to be controlled. So for many years, MAPI Research Trust team has controlled the electronic migration of patient questionnaires on behalf of the copyright holders, following the EQA best practices and the electronic implementation guidelines. So what kind of check they make? So first of all, regarding the display. So they are checking the scrolling that is not admitted. For instance, we need to have only one item per screen, not to miss some information on the screen. Regarding what kind of layout to use, is it a portrait or is it a landscape? So it's highly recommended to use portrait layout. Once again, not to miss any information on the screen. And also to check the background color, like the dark background color is really not recommended for the users. And also to check that only one response can be selected by the patient and recorded. Regarding the navigation, they are checking that the back, next, and submit buttons are included in the screens, and also that there is a summary screen so that the patient could review his answers before submission of the questionnaire. Then regarding the completion, the user should also be able to get back to a question and modify it. And MAPI Research Trust also checks with the QA developers whether the skipped questions are permitted, because sometimes it can also jeopardize the scientific integrity of the questionnaire. And the last but not the least, the copyright information. So always we check that the copyright notice of the copyright holder is included in the screens, so to avoid the misuse of the questionnaire in the future. So only after all these items, all these features have been checked and have been considered as compliant to the EQA best practices and EQA guidelines, MAPI Research Trust team can provide certification to the users so they could provide it to the regulators. So let's see an example of a migration of the questionnaire that we distribute for many years on behalf of GL Assessment, that is a part of GL Education Group in the UK. This is a gold standard questionnaire that is called HADS, and it is used to measure depression and anxiety. So here the challenge for the IT company, clear, is the migration of the Hebrew version, and to pay attention that the back and next buttons need to be reversed, and that the language is written from right to left. So this is on the same. If Frederic, could you please change the the slide to show you that the items is the same? They need to be written from right to left, so to be sure that this is the same thing included in the screens. And here you can see two examples where really the EQA best practices have not been respected. So clearly there is a use of red and green color, and we know that some patients can be color blinded. So these two colors are clearly not recommended to be used. Then there is the dark background, and from the EQA best practices, we know that we need to have a light background, as it's sometimes difficult for some patients to read on the dark one. That the scrolling, so clearly you can see here that the patient might miss some response choices. He can just see one, and for instance, from never, and sometimes he can miss one of the response choices. The same on the right screen, you can see that I think they wanted to use more design or something more colorful, but here, this like a chatbot used. We should to keep in mind that you can't do whatever you want when you migrate a scientific measure. It should be user-friendly, and you should follow the electronic implementation guidelines and best practices to avoid any confusion and loss of the time for a patient. So to conclude, we can say that the publishers and also the QA developers, they're not really the experts on linguistic validation, and they're not experts in electronic migration. So this is why MAPI Research Trust team are here to accompany you, to bring their expertise and their skills, as we follow for many years all these electronic migration guidelines that have been provided by different task forces like Critical Path Institute, EQA Consortium, or by health authorities like FDA and EMA. So Frederica, I will let you conclude.
Thank you. So if you had to remember something from this presentation, is that for publishers, a patient questionnaire, so clinical outcome assessment, may be a content to be licensed. But for clinician researchers and industries, these are scientifically validated measures that need to be used, linguistically validated, and electronically migrated in a rigorous way. Indeed, these clinical outcome assessments require a very specific expertise and a very specific process.
If the questionnaire is not managed properly, if its use is not controlled, the risk here is that the questionnaire is no longer used by the scientific community. So MAPI Research Trust team is here to bring its expertise to accompany STM publishers and also to highlight really your reputation of excellence in research. Thank you very much. So here are our email addresses. If anyone has any questions, feel free to write to us and we will be able to reply. Thank you.